Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our previous class, we talked about how Woodrow Wilson was going to approach the rest of the world. Let us discuss today the world that Woodrow Wilson would have to approach. So, dear students, incline your ears and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 4, identify the long-term causes and the immediate circumstances that led to World War I. You should be able to describe the first 2 years of the war and summarize American public opinion. And number 6, identify the weapons and new medical problems of World War I. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 4. The causes of the World War I are divided into basically two camps, the long-term and the short-term causes. We'll start with the long-term causes. They'd been building for decades, but had never really exploded into war. We might identify 4 pieces of this: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the alliance system. Starting with nationalism. Nationalism is the devotion to interests or culture of one's nation. It's not necessarily bad on its own to be a nationalist, to think of like, I'm interested in my own country's history and I'm proud of my nationality. But it did lead to competition and jealousy between nations. A lot of people feared Germany's growing power in Europe. Germany had, for most of its history, been kind of an irrelevant collection of variety of principalities held together in the old Holy Roman Empire, but it was united together into a united empire. It really pushed itself forward into the world stage, and united Germany was much more productive. Various ethnic groups were resenting being dominated by outsiders, though, and they wanted independence. You also see that like Russia considered itself to be the protector of all the Slavic peoples in all the other countries. Like Russia just thought of themselves as the big brother that would look out of other people. And these, the fear of Germany, the Russian protectionism, these other countries which had gotten subsumed by, larger countries, all of those things kind of fuel a nationalist unrest. Secondly, let's talk about imperialism. Germany's growing industry pushed them and their rivals to take new overseas territories. Countries hope to expand their empires and go support their resources and their trade. As soon as you had more countries under your control, you could do more business, but you also got more resources being put into it. Imperialism was fueled by nationalism, as each country tried to compete with others to go get the most imperial power, most pieces of their empire. Number 3, militarism is the developing of modern armed forces and then using those armed forces as a tool of diplomacy. Because the cost of building and defending empires was tough, it led to more military spending. By 1890, for instance, Germany had the strongest army on the European continent. Their competition with Britain and sea power led others to join in the naval arms race. And those pieces were putting together that, you're proud of your country, you want your country to succeed maybe above all the other ones, you have a large military to go support your large imperial power, and all of those things kind of get wrapped together in an uneasy system that needs some way to hold it all together. So there's also the development of number 4, the alliance system. Alliances seem to give a country security, as nations became unwilling to disrupt the balance of power. Like a country wouldn't go attack another country because that second country had an alliance with a half dozen others, and if you attack a country, attack one, then you're going to end up fighting them all. And that alliance system was designed to create an uneasy but enduring peace. And in general, people fell into 2 essential camps: what becomes known as the Triple Entente, also known as the Allies. This is a group known as Great Britain, France, and Russia. And you also have the Central Powers. The Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, to a lesser extent, and later the Ottoman Empire. So that the alliance system in Europe kind of revolved around these 2 central camps. The short-term cause was actually kind of a minor incident. So we have the long-term causes of World War I. The short-term cause was kind of a nothing burger, actually. It was the spark, though, that ignited the powder keg of European tensions. An assassination led to a war, and alliances complicated that conflict. The Balkan Peninsula had long been known as the powder keg of Europe, like gunpowder, ready to explode, because of the ethnic rivalries among the Balkan people, and because the leading powers of Europe had economic and political interests there. And here we meet Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was shot by a minor Serbian nationalist terrorist gang, kind of a poorly run terrorist gang who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In response, though, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, expecting a short war through a small and kind of poor country, but the alliance system lit up its alarms and it pulled one nation after another into the war. That takes us to Roman numeral number 5 as the fighting starts. The first declaration of war had actually happened a couple of months before most of the fighting gets started, but most historians think that the war became a major international conflict in August 4th of 1914. That's when Germany invaded Belgium on their way to go attacking France. The Germans planned on fighting two fronts at the same time, to hold off Russia in the east while advancing east to go once they go attack France. They figured that France would fall easily, and once they had taken France, then they would turn their eyes over to go fight Russia. They figured Russia would be a much harder battle, but that Russia would mobilize slower, and the first attack then is to France. By spring of 1915, two parallel systems of trenches developed to go cross through France. On one side was Germany's Central Powers, on the other side France and England representing the Entente power. Between the two trenches was an area known as the No Man's Land. It was a barren expanse of mud between the two opposing trenches. The scale of killing was horrific and unprecedented, but ultimately the fighting was inconclusive. Armies just fought over and over to gain a few yards of ground between the two sides of the trenches in bloody, very deadly trench warfare. Subpoint B, Americans looking at this conflict didn't really have a side in the fight. It really had divided loyalties. On one hand, you have the socialists in America. Remember, socialism, while it's not like a major political movement, was not insignificant. And socialists looked at this war and said, this is just a war between capitalism and imperialism and a struggle between Germany and England to go control markets and control colonies, and the socialists didn't want to have any bit of it. You also have these groups known as the pacifists. The pacifists was a major movement in America at this time, and they include people like William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, a major pacifist at the time, believed that all war was basically evil, and the United States should set an example of peace to the rest of the world. William Jennings Bryan's not a nobody at this point. He's serving as Secretary of State in the Wilson administration, representing a very strong non-interventionist approach when it comes to war. A lot of people just thought that, the United States just shouldn't go entering other people's wars. That's just not a fight for us. Naturalized citizens, those are citizens in America that have come from other countries, so naturalized citizens were concerned about the effect of the war on their country of birth. For example, Americans of German descent tended to side with Germany, and French descendants tended to side with the Entente. Many Irish Americans looked at it and said, hey, meanwhile, Great Britain is occupying Ireland, and maybe while nobody's watching the store, we'll go push for an Irish independence movement. So, while Britain's distracted elsewhere. A lot of native-born Americans look at this, and they felt a bond with Great Britain, the nation's ancestry and language and democracy and legal system. It was the old special bond with the old country. The United States had stronger economic ties with the Entente side than with the Central Powers. And while the United States was shipping millions of dollars worth of supplies and out to the Allies, requests were still coming in. Wilson insisted the United States wasn't going to get into this fight because it was a war that didn't promote democracy. Even though most people thought the United States would probably, if they enter the war, enter on the side of the Entente, part of the Entente included the country of Russia, and Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. Tsar Nicholas was a very undemocratic monarch. He was essentially an absolute ruler, and Wilson refused himself to ally with somebody that he considered to be a dictator. In 1917, the United States had mobilized for war, though, against the Central Powers to ensure Allied repayment for debts and to prevent Germany's threats to U.S. shipping. Subpoint C. The hard conditions of the soldiers inspired some people to go reach out on a more humanitarian level. One of the more interesting groups was the Knights of Columbus, the Catholic men's organization in the United States. The Knights of Columbus established army huts in war zones. There they would provide they would provide food and reading material and hot showers for the soldiers. They sponsored sporting events and entertainments and just tried to humanize the life of soldiers in a pretty inhuman conflict. With the motto, everyone's welcome and everything's free, the Knights of Columbus army huts served any soldier, whether or not they're Catholic, who just needed a break from the combat. Other relief organizations served exclusively Protestant or exclusively Jewish soldiers, but no Catholic organizations were offering any help before the Knights of Columbus. In particular, the Knights sought out units which had been cut off from normal supply routes. Army huts also offered spiritual support for soldiers. A chaplain had been stationed in every army hut to offer mass and counseling and confession and even last rites to the soldiers. The hut staff arranged for funeral and burial details whenever that was necessary too. After the war, the Knights of Columbus provided medical services and cleanup and improved the image of Americans after Wilson's kind of botched diplomacy that hurt the Americans' reputation. Roman numeral number 6. Let's spend a little bit more time talking about the fighting over there. And first we'll spend some time in trench warfare. Along Germany's western front, which was France, both sides dug trenches for soldiers to fight from. They grew into an underground network of bunkers. Some trenches were for fighting and others were for carrying supplies, and there were back trenches for medical treatment. Being in a trench was pretty unpleasant. You're standing in a hole in the ground, and you were either swamped in cold mud or left out to bake in the sun. Soldiers always had to deal with rats and lice. Many developed a particular malady known as trench foot. After months of standing in wet, dirty mud, the foot and leg bones, this is gross, of the soldiers basically just softened into a kind of infected goo. I don't want to show you any pictures of it, but they're out there if you want to see it. Trenches meant that war could be very bloody and yet achieve no advances into the enemy's territory. Take, for instance, the First Battle of the Somme in 1916. Great Britain lost 60,000 soldiers on the first day. Final casualties of the Battle of the Somme, 1.2 million people. Yet for all of those lives lost, only 7 miles of ground changed hands. The no man's land between the opposing trenches was especially dangerous. If soldiers tried to advance out of their trench, they would be totally unprotected. The result was a 4-year stalemate where neither side was able to defeat the other. We also see in World War I a development of a new technology, new kinds of war technology. The rapid-fire Gatling gun had been invented clear before the Civil War, but industrial technology greatly improved on that by World War I. And modern machine guns were spraying bullets into enemy targets. Barbed wire, which had been invented for ranching, successfully tangled up the battle lines to keep the enemy out. But it also kept either side from really advancing. And in C, I want to talk about what's probably the most enduring piece of, like the most memorable piece of World War I, and that's of chemical weapons. At first, the French tried to use tear gas to go break up German forces, but tear gas was ineffective. It was weak. It was too weak to disturb their enemy. The Germans also tried a tear gas, but it had a tendency, its chemical was a little more unstable, and had a tendency to freeze rather than vaporize, so it just made it worthless. The Germans then started using chlorine gas as a weapon. They lined up these thousands of gas tanks, and when the wind was right, they opened up the valves to emit the green chlorine gas onto enemy lines. Chlorine is an awful way to die. It burns the eyes, the throats, and the notes of the victims until you just slowly suffocate. Its first use was wildly effective. The Entente forces panicked and ran. And as they ran, they inhaled more gas than they would breathe just sitting there. But the people quickly discovered the weaknesses of chlorine gas. First, chlorine gas falls, so the safest thing to do was to just stay in place and stand up in the trench. Stand up in the trench, the chlorine gas falls and eventually will dissipate. There it would go and kill the wounded, but that's not really the target, right? It was also water soluble, so if the troops just took a towel and got it wet and held a towel over their face, then they could breathe normally and just go along with the chlorine gas. And if the wind changed, the chlorine would go back onto the attackers, and then the people that were trying to use it as the weapon would have it blow back on them. Still, chlorine remained a powerful psychological weapon, and the green gas across the field, it could really inspire panic on the other side. The French developed a different kind of gas known as phosgene. Phosgene was a gas that was colorless. It smelled like wet hay, so it basically went unnoticed until the damage was done. Phosgene isn't as well known as the other gases, but it was more successful than most, killing 85,000 people, far more than all of the other gases. The German introduction of mustard gas is probably the most famous piece of chemical warfare. Introduced in 1917, mustard gas was shot out in large artillery shells. When it landed, it burst open and an oily liquid soaked into the soil and then slowly emitted gas for days or for weeks. And it was awful. Its victims were covered in yellow blisters and it burned the person's eyes until it blinded them. Itchy throats swelled shut and the victim choked to death. Internal and external bleeding was common, and soldiers trapped in their trenches were particularly vulnerable. Mustard gas terrorized the enemy, but it also made it pretty impossible to advance. If German troops marched into the affected areas, they would suffer the same problems. Subpoint D. Though the British had been using tanks as early as 1916 in the Battle of the Somme, the early versions of tanks weren't very effective. But by 1917, the British learned to use tanks to go tear down barbed wire and open up the no man's land to go clear a path. Also, the development of airplanes. Early airplanes were flimsy. They were basically only suitable for scouting until pilots began to just bring a gun up there in the cockpit with him and try to shoot the other guy out of the air. Then airplanes began individual air combat, become known as dogfights, first with handguns and later with mounted machine guns. Later airplanes were stronger and faster and eventually began running huge bombing loads. By 1918, the British were flying 22,000 bombers over enemy targets. Observation balloons were used extensively, but they were also the prime targets of ace pilots. So the balloon would go up to go see the battlefield, but be kind of a floating target to go get shot down. We also see the Germans develop a new technology known as an Unterseeboot. Unterseeboot, German word, means underwater boat. So we're talking about U-boats or submarines. They were mostly used for breaking up blockades and for stopping the Entente forces from receiving supplies, and for also filling Allied sailors with terror. By 1917, Germany's U-boats had sunk twice as much ship tonnage as the Allies had entirely built. Subpoint E. These new weapons and tactics led to horrific injuries and hazards. Troops fought amongst filth and pests and polluted waters and poison gas and dead bodies. They were sleep deprived. The constant bombardment and stresses of battle fatigue produced a condition known as shell shock, where soldiers' nervous systems were just shattered by the stress and noise of battle. Today we don't call it shell shock anymore. It's better known as post-traumatic stress disorder. But physical problems experienced by soldiers included dysentery and trench foot and trench mouth, and it's just awful. And then it's going to get worse before it gets any better. The story of World War I is fascinating, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.